In 1874, what Dr. McCulloch had discovered in the remote hills of Indiana would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about heredity, morality, and human nature itself. This was not just a family tree, it was a roadmap to genetic hell, and the story of how one bloodline became America's most inbred dynasty. The year was 1874. And the Industrial Revolution was transforming America into a modern nation. Cities were growing, railroads were connecting distant territories, and scientific discovery was pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. But in the isolated valleys of southern Indiana, time seemed to have stopped entirely. Here, in a region locals called the Hollow, lived a family that had been cut off from the outside world for nearly a century. Dr. McCulloch first encountered this family through his work at the Indiana State Charity Organization. As the organization's secretary, he was tasked with investigating reports of severe mental deficiency and criminal behavior in rural communities. What began as a routine investigation would become an obsession that would consume the rest of his professional life. The family McCulloch studied was known by the pseudonym the Tribe of Ishmael in his published reports, though their real name was the Juke family. They had originally settled in the Indiana wilderness in the 1780s, drawn by the promise of cheap land and the freedom to live without interference from neighbors or authorities. The patriarch, whom McCulloch called Old Max, had established his homestead in a valley so remote that it took a full day's journey on horseback to reach the nearest town. What made this isolation particularly dangerous was Old Max's philosophy about family. He believed that keeping bloodlines pure and concentrated would strengthen his descendants. He encouraged his children to marry within the family, viewing outsiders as threats to their way of life. This practice, combined with the family's complete isolation from medical care, education, and social services, created a genetic nightmare that would persist for generations. By the time Dr. McCulloch began his investigation, the family had grown to over 200 individuals spread across 5 generations. What he found in that remote valley defied belief. Houses built from scrap wood and mud housed multiple generations living in conditions that shocked even the most hardened social workers. Children who should have been in school roamed the property like wild animals, many unable to speak and complete sentences or perform basic tasks. McCulloch's initial visit to the Hollow was accompanied by a local sheriff who had been dealing with the family's criminal activities for years. As their wagon approached the main homestead, the doctor noted in his journal that an unnatural silence fell over the valley. Dogs that had been barking went quiet, and faces appeared briefly in windows before disappearing behind crude curtains. The family's matriarch, a woman in her 60s, whom McCulloch called Mother Juke, greeted with suspicion and hostility. She was, by all accounts, the product of a union between first cousins, and her own children were the result of relationships with her brothers and half-brothers. The physical effects of generations of inbreeding were immediately apparent. She walked with a severe limp, her left eye wandered uncontrollably, and her speech was slurred and difficult to understand. But it was the children that truly horrified Dr. McCulloch. Of the 37 children he encountered during his first visit, only 12 appeared to have normal intellectual capacity. The others displayed a range of developmental disabilities that he had never seen concentrated in a single location. Some could not walk properly due to malformed limbs. Others seemed unable to process language or recognize their own family members. What made McCulloch's investigation particularly disturbing was his discovery of the family record-keeping system. Unlike most rural families of the era, the Jukes had maintained detailed genealogical records. apparently taking pride in their isolation and genetic purity. These documents, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be a family-specific dialect, revealed the true extent of their inbreeding. The documents showed that over 5 generations, there had been 37 documented cases of siblings marrying siblings, 15 cases of parents marrying their own children, and countless instances of first and second cousins producing offspring together. The family had developed their own twisted interpretation of biblical teachings, believing that keeping bloodlines pure was a religious duty. McCulloch spent months interviewing family members, documenting their family tree, and observing their daily lives. What he discovered was a community that had essentially created its own genetic dead end. The intellectual disabilities were just the beginning. The family also suffered from extraordinarily high rates of deafness, blindness, seizure disorders, and physical deformities that made normal life impossible.
The doctor's notes from this period reveal his growing horror at what he was witnessing. In one entry, he wrote, "Today I observed a child, approximately 8 years of age, who appeared to be the product of a union between father and daughter. The child cannot speak, cannot walk without assistance, and seems to lack basic human recognition. When I approached with food, the child cowered as if I were a predator rather than a help." Perhaps most disturbing was McCulloch's discovery of the family's attitude toward their condition. Rather than seeing their disabilities as problems to be addressed, many family members viewed them as signs of their special status. They had developed a belief system that portrayed their isolation and genetic abnormalities as proof of their chosen nature, set apart from the corrupted outside world. The family's criminal activities, which had first brought them to the attention of authorities, were largely the result of their desperation and inability to function in normal society. Unable to hold regular employment due to their disabilities, they survived through theft, poaching, and what McCulloch described as primitive forms of extortion against neighboring farmers. Local law enforcement had been dealing with the family for decades, but their remote location and the complexity of their crimes made prosecution difficult. Many of the family members could not be held legally responsible for their actions due to their mental disabilities, creating a legal and ethical nightmare for the justice system. McCulloch's investigation revealed that the family's isolation had also created a unique form of social organization. Leadership was determined not by age or wisdom, but by physical strength and the ability to intimidate others. The family had developed its own primitive form of government, with disputes settled through violence and resources distributed according to a complex system of family hierarchies that favored the products of the most inbred unions. The medical implications of McCulloch's findings were staggering. He documented cases of children born with conditions that modern medicine would recognize as the result of severe genetic bottlenecking, autosomal recessive disorders that only manifest when both parents carry identical genetic mutations. These children suffered from intellectual disabilities so severe that they could not be educated or integrated into society in any meaningful way. But perhaps most chilling aspect of McCulloch's investigation was his discovery of the family's expansion plans. Despite the obvious problems created by their inbreeding, the family actively sought to recruit new members through kidnapping and forced marriage. They had developed a system of capturing young women from neighboring areas, bringing them into the family structure, and forcing them to bear children who would be raised according to the family's twisted values. McCulloch documented several cases of young women who had disappeared from nearby communities, only to be found months or years later living in the hollow as unwilling wives to family members. These women were kept in a state of virtual slavery, prevented from leaving by threats of violence and the knowledge that their children would be harmed if they attempted to escape. McCulloch's attempts to rescue these women were largely unsuccessful. Local authorities lacked the resources to mount sustained operations in such remote territory, and the family's knowledge of the terrain gave them significant advantages in avoiding law enforcement. Several rescue attempts resulted in violent confrontations that left both family members and law enforcement officers injured. McCulloch's investigation also revealed the family's impact on the surrounding community. Their presence had effectively created a zone of terror that extended for miles around their homestead. Local farmers lived in constant fear of theft and violence, and many had abandoned their properties rather than continue living in proximity to the family.
The economic impact was severe as well. The family's criminal activities had driven down property values throughout the region, and their reputation had made it difficult for the area to attract new settlers or businesses. What had once been a thriving agricultural community had become a virtual ghost town, with many residents fleeing to more populated areas. As McCulloch's investigation continued, he began to understand that the family represented something more than just a medical curiosity. They were a window into humanity's darkest possibilities. Their story revealed what could happen when isolation, ignorance, and genetic catastrophe combined to create a community that existed outside the normal boundaries of human society. The doctor's final report, published in 1888, would become one of the most controversial documents in American medical history. His detailed family tree, showing 5 generations of systematic inbreeding, challenged prevailing theories about heredity and human development. The report also raised uncomfortable questions about society's responsibility toward communities that had essentially removed themselves from civilization. McCulloch's work on the Juke family would later influence American eugenics movements and forced sterilization programs, applications of his research that the doctor himself came to regret. In his later years, he wrote that his intention had been to understand and help such families, not to provide ammunition for those who would use genetic differences to justify discrimination and violence. The family's story did not end with McCulloch's investigation. By the early 1900s, most of the surviving members had been institutionalized or had died due to the medical complications of their genetic conditions. The few who remained capable of independent living had scattered to different parts of the country, taking new names and attempting to blend into normal society. Today, the hollow, where the family once lived, has been reclaimed by nature. The crude houses have collapsed, and the family's carefully maintained genealogical records have been lost to time and weather. But the impact of their story continues to reverberate through American medical and social history. Dr. McCulloch's investigation raised questions that we still grapple with today. What happens when communities isolate themselves so completely that they lose touch with basic human norms? How do we balance respect for individual choice with the need to protect vulnerable populations? And what responsibility does society have to intervene when isolation and ignorance create conditions that harm children and perpetuate cycles of suffering? The story of America's most inbred bloodline serves as a dark reminder of the importance of community, education, and medical care in maintaining human dignity and potential. It shows us what can happen when fear of the outside world combines with ignorance to create conditions that destroy the very thing they claim to protect. As we reflect on this haunting chapter in American history, we must ask ourselves, how many other isolated communities might exist today, hidden in remote valleys and forgotten corners of our nation? And what responsibility do we have to ensure that the horrors witnessed by Dr. McCulloch in that Indiana hollow are never repeated? What state are you watching from tonight? Have you ever encountered stories of isolated communities in your area? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has made you think about the dark corners of American history, consider subscribing for more investigations into the mysteries that shaped our nation. The truth is often more terrifying than fiction,
And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make us most uncomfortable. The Juke family's legacy reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and community involvement are not just virtues, they are necessities for preventing the kind of human tragedy that Dr. McCulloch documented in The Hollow over a century ago.